everyone. Good evening. My name is Carla Burns, and I am very delighted to be here for our Café Contemplative Mindfulness is for Everyone series. Maybe you are all joining me in a lovely cafe drink right now that we can share together. So this is part 2 of our series, titled Roots of Liberation, Integrating Ancestral Wisdom and Contemplative Practice for Ecological Healing and Collective Transformation. And tonight's presentation is with Betsy Gonzalez Blohm. So I have a comment here that someone is not able to hear, so I just want to pause for a moment and make sure that people can hear me. Maybe if our tech support can send me a message letting me know. Okay, great. Thank you. So I've been told that most folks can hear, so I'm going to keep going. So I'm just so excited to have Betsy with us tonight, offering her wisdom, offering her brilliance, offering really the passion for who she is and who I know her to be. I've had the pleasure of sharing workspace with her and practice space with her and friendship with her. And it's just so wonderful to have her here this evening. And I want to fill you all in a little bit in on her bio. So Betsy Gonzalez Blohm spent a decade-long career as an educator in public schools, teaching and leading for equity before becoming a professor and dean at Naropa University. Her lifelong journey exploring racial identity while engaging in social justice work has taught her that the earth, reconnection, collective liberation, and ancestral healing are interdependent. She weaves mindfulness, ancestral healing, and embodiment practices into justice, equity, and inclusion programs for businesses, nonprofits, and schools. And she's currently designing ancestral reconnection for collective liberation retreats. Oh, nice. To support participants in cultivating grounded roots of wholeness from which to act for the benefit of our earth and each other. And that's just, I think, a small sliver of all of the magic that Betsy has to offer us. And I just also want to mention that, in her description for tonight's programming, she starts out by saying that it is no secret that Mother Earth needs healing. And I think that we all know that it's, no secret. And yet sometimes it can feel really hidden or secretive in the ways in which we can actually start to address healing towards collective liberation and transformational healing for our earth, for our planet, and for each other. And so I just feel really excited to have you here tonight, Betsy, to give us some wisdom and some knowledge and how we can start to make some of these, I think what you're referring to is maybe some more of these invisible aspects, things that are missing in the movement, things that are missing in our practices, more accessible and more visible to us. So just thank you so much for offering this kind of gift that we all know our world really needs. We do need healing. So thank you for being here to share that with us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Carla, and thank you for being so inspiring to work with and such a dear friend. I'd also like to thank Jordan Qualia for this opportunity tonight and the Extended Campus team for your work, and to all of you who have showed up this evening. Appreciations also to my vibrant ancestors for all the support they offer, so much of which I'm not even conscious of most of the time. And gratitude also to my unwell ancestors for offering burdens that invite transformation. And I'd particularly like to thank my sister Caroline, whose leadership, commitment to brilliant sanity and magic are the reasons I'm on this path of study. And just a note that if it's easeful and you can gather a glass of water and a candle or incense or Palo Santo, towards the end of the evening, we will have an opportunity to do an elements practice. And so those might be helpful. So I am passionate about this topic. And I'm just checking on the chat to make sure all the tech is going okay. Right. So I'm passionate about this topic, integrating ancestral wisdom and contemplative practice for ecological healing and collective transformation, because I've been working in the area of justice and inclusion for 15 years, focusing on racism, patriarchy, and classism in the US. And I think ancestral reconnection and contemplative practice can be the medicines needed to sustain social change work. It's relatively new that I've been integrating ancestral reconnection as part of my own spiritual practice, and it's been transformational for me personally. Ancestry work has the potential to reconnect us with the roots that ground and nourish us on our quest for personal and societal transformation. So I thought we could start with a grounding contemplative practice. And as part of that practice, I'll ask you to visualize, or if you're not a visual person, sense into what your roots would look and feel like if you had roots like trees connecting you into the earth. So here's some visuals to get you thinking about that. And just sense into what your roots feel like, what thickness, texture, color. Maybe they are like those prairie grass roots, thin and spidery and abundant. They can soak in water even in dry climates. Or maybe they're more like the aspen roots in the upper right corner, although it looks like that image is not appearing at the moment. But if you visualize aspen roots, they're all interconnected to each other under the ground. So just take a moment to sense into, hold on, I'm seeing lots of things in the chat. Can you see all of the slide now? Okay, thank you. So using these images or just visualizing for yourself what your roots might look and feel like, we'll try out this sense perception meditation to ground us in the present moment. And just to know that everything in this guided practice is an invitation. So adapt it for however works for you. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors of the land we're on as a practice of remembering to bring this lens of Indigenous rights and the need for reparations to everyday life and work. So if you are in Boulder, like me, we are on the land of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho nations. And this land was also used by many other Indigenous nations for ritual, trade, and hunting. And we recognize that these First Nations peoples are still here in spite of attempted genocide. So with that acknowledgement, it can be helpful for grounding to feel both feet firmly planted on the earth beneath you. Taking a moment to feel your seat. And really with each breath, sense into or visualize if your roots were like tree roots, what color, thickness, texture would they be? And really sense into them, connecting you through the floorboards, through the earth's crust, down into the soil, connecting you with Mother Earth and rooting you deep into the soil. And on the next inhale, see if you can feel your full length, allowing your length to remind you of your inherent dignity that, as Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams says, does not have to be earned and cannot be taken away. And with each exhale, see if you can allow yourself to relax just a bit more into being held by the seat beneath you and Mother Earth beneath. So noticing if you're holding yourself unnecessarily, rigidity or tightness. And with each exhale, just relaxing a little further into that sense of being held. Now using sense perceptions to bring us more and more into the present moment and into our bodies, we'll start with sight. And your eyes can be closed or open, resting softly on the table or the floor before you. And the aim is to experience seeing as receiving. So if your eyes are closed, receiving the darkness, bathing in the darkness, noticing any subtle movement, subtle colors, texture to the darkness behind your eyes. And if your eyes are open, similarly, experiencing seeing without labeling or making judgments if you can, and just experience color, texture that's right before you as a way of coming a little bit closer into this moment right now. And now noticing the air against your face, feeling the volume inside your head, using sense to come into embodied presence. So maybe you notice the temperature inside your nostrils with each inhale. Maybe noticing any smells or tastes as a way of coming deeper into the body. Bringing gentle awareness, noticing if there's any tightness or tension in the jaw, not needing to fix it, but just bringing your awareness there. Just that awareness is a kindness. Feeling the length and volume of your throat, scanning your awareness down your shoulders, maybe noticing the feeling of clothing against your skin. Feeling the full length and volume of your arms and fingers. Noticing subtle sensations, temperature, tingling, movement, tightness. As Tara Brach says, feeling into the aliveness from the inside out. And now sensing into your heart space and lungs, noticing any emotions, sensations, maybe your heartbeat, noticing if it's fast, slow, imperceptible. Feeling the air inside your lungs and bringing that awareness down deep into the belly. Bringing awareness to your hips and your seat. Again, noticing if you're holding yourself up. And with each exhale, relaxing a little bit more into allowing the earth to hold you. Feeling the full length and volume of your legs. Again, sensing into that aliveness from the inside out. Noticing clothing against your skin, air against your skin, temperature. And again, feeling where your feet are touching the earth beneath you and deepening into those roots. Just noticing your state of consciousness right now. I'll close with a Celtic prayer. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. I hope that helped you come more fully into the present moment and into embodied presence, and maybe recognize the support we enjoy from Mother Earth, who is always here supporting us, whether we're mindful of her or not. Our disconnection from the earth, nature, and each other not only causes ecological destruction, as Carla was mentioning, but is also a great source of human suffering. We've become less connected to our roots, each other, and our most authentic natures over the last centuries, and particularly with the rise of technology. So this talk is both about individual suffering as well as collective suffering and earth suffering, which intersect with racial injustice, sexism, religious hate, etc. I'm drawn to ancestral healing work because I notice that often when we work relentlessly for racial justice or climate justice, we end up burning ourselves out, or we fuel our work with guilt or aggression. Often, particularly in racial justice work, white people's guilt gets in the way of acting in solidarity. So from my experience, I see that we can sustain the work of collective transformation for the good of Mother Earth and each other by reconnecting with our roots. Each and every one of us has a lineage of intergenerational trauma of some sort, as well as indigenous ancestral wisdom of some sort. All of our ancestors were once indigenous to somewhere. And many of us have lost our connection to that wisdom, whether because of enslavement, violent oppression, or assimilation into dominant culture. So reconnecting to the earth wisdom that our ancestors practiced before systems of colonization and exploitation of both humans and the earth became dominant, reconnecting to those practices is a form of contemplative practice that holds the potential for ecological healing and collective liberation. So I'll start by sharing why mindfulness and contemplative practices feel so important for collective liberation work. And for this talk, I'm defining collective liberation as the liberation from individual suffering and community suffering, so that all beings, including the plant, animal, tree, elemental beings, can be free to live as their authentic selves and with enough. So individual and community suffering are caused in part by systemic injustices such as racism, sexism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc. And individual and community suffering contribute to systemic injustices. So injustice causes a great amount of suffering, of course, and we usually perpetuate these harms because we are suffering in some deep way. James Baldwin says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And I would add that once we stop clinging to hate or self-righteousness or aggression, we're forced to feel how disconnected from each other and the earth we've become, and how gravely we've been hurting her. I know that I personally spent years in social justice circles trying to be the good white person, competing to show how good I was. And so I was teaching social justice with a lot of self-righteousness and aggression and shame. And that was because it was easier to feel angry at injustice than to face the devastating heartbreak of it and my own complicity in it. So contemplative practice is a support to move through this suffering, to be with this pain, to hold our pain and that of others with compassion at the individual, collective, and ecological levels. Thich Nhat Hanh says, we don't need to control our body, mind, and breath. We can just be there for them. We allow them to be ourselves. This is not violence. And I feel how difficult this is for many of us. We don't need to control. It's hard for us, for me at least, to let go of controlling my body, mind, and breath, because our society and our history is dominated in many ways by control. Control of women's bodies, the right to marry, violence for control of land and water, controlling our emotions. I could go on. So this competition for resources, for status, and control that causes so much inequity and destruction of our planet can be healed if we begin by releasing control of our body, mind, and breath. Maybe this can allow us to release control of our ideas of the right way to be, the right amount of stuff to possess, the right way to be a man, and on and on and on, so that those of us interested in working together for Earth healing don't get in our own way because of our conditioning. So contemplative practice has the potential to bring more spaciousness, more freedom to our minds, so that our unconscious bias, which we know we all have, and our habitual patterns don't inhibit our work for collective liberation. So these are just some of the ways that contemplative practice and collective liberation work are mutually supportive. Mandaza Kandemwa, a carrier of many earth and water spirits in Zimbabwe, says, deep mindfulness arises from a view of our radical interconnectedness, that which links us each and all in our particular pain and possibility to earth, fire, wind, water, and space. Be like the ocean that refuses no river. So I'll pause to let you reflect on what comes up for you when you hear that quote. Contemplative practice can support us in moving through our pain by feeling it, and by feeling how both our pain and our desire for peace and love links us to the earth, fire, wind, water, space, and to our fellow human beings. I really think that the best way to fight climate change or transphobia or racism is to feel how much pain it causes each of us, even those that are not oppressed by these systems, even those of us that even benefit materially from these systems are suffering from them, because they disconnect us from our own hearts, from each other, and from the earth herself. There's a poem called For Every Woman by Nancy R. Smith, which exemplifies this really well. So before I read it, I invite you to reconnect with your breath, the sea beneath you, connect with your roots, connecting back with the earth beneath you. So that you have a resource and can notice what this excerpt of the poem brings up for you. Nancy Smith writes, for every woman who is tired of acting weak when she knows she is strong, there is a man who is tired of appearing strong when he feels vulnerable. For every woman who is tired of acting dumb, There is a man who is burdened with the constant expectation of knowing everything. For every woman who is tired of being called an emotional female. There is a man who is denied the right to weep and to be gentle. For every woman who takes a step toward her own liberation, there is a man who finds the way to freedom has been made a little easier. This poem teaches us about gender and how patriarchy harms all of us. And the same could be said of racism. While white people like myself are not oppressed by racism, we do suffer because of our participation in it or our complicity in it. There's a quote by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams in the book Radical Dharma that struck me really hard the first time I read it. And they said something along the lines of, white people need to inquire into what is running through their veins because of their participation in enslavement. And that resonated. To better understand that suffering, which is different from suffering from being oppressed, we might ask ourselves, what does it take to justify dehumanizing, enslaving, torturing, burning, starving another human being, let alone an entire community of beings? What did it take to murder all the buffalo as an act of domination against First Nations and Mother Earth? This brings me to the way in which ancestral reconnection relates to contemplative practice and supports collective liberation and earth healing. So think of what this little boy must have been feeling. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was horror, maybe it was heart annihilation before his heart had to close and harden all the way to protect himself from that scale of brutality. Maybe he had already witnessed his family participate in the murder of Indigenous people and his heart had already hardened. Maybe he was already completely socialized not to see the earth and her beings as sacred. So at 9 or so, he was already rootless, groundless, even as his parents stole solid ground from others. So how did his trauma from standing on this desecration, from being forced to desensitize himself from his connection to other living beings, impact his children and his grandchildren? Imagine the Indigenous people of this land who mourned the sacred buffalo, who maybe also felt rage, despair, on and on. And you might take a moment, notice sensations in the body or emotions rising, noticing if movement might be helpful, stretching, or returning again to the sense of feeling your roots connecting you with the earth below so that you are supported in whatever's arising. Just feeling back into your roots and try to listen to your body, whether it's wanting to move or stretch. Seeing what it needs. There's so much trauma running through all of our lineages. And this is not to compare the suffering of white people to that of Indigenous people today. White people are not oppressed because of our race. And Indigenous people suffer from disproportionate poverty, addiction, health issues, educational malpractice, food injustice, et cetera, because of violent settler colonialism and racism. So I'm certainly not trying to create an equivalency of suffering. Comparing suffering really isn't all that useful or possible anyway. It's just to say that there is great suffering for all of us, particularly since colonization. And it's useful to acknowledge the intergenerational trauma in most of our lineages today, whether our ancestors were more impacted by oppression or more impacted by doing the oppressing. And with the vastness of each of our ancestry, we all have both wounds running through our DNA to some degree. But because colonization and industrialization ripped all of us in different ways from our connection with plants, animals, and earth, I think it will take healing on this earth and ancestral level in tandem with institutional and interpersonal change to reach a healthy world and regain balance. According to the Mayan Wisdom Project, the Maya believe that climate change is the result of modern day humanity separating itself from its roots, its connection with existence, and from groups of people and industry leaders believing they're more important than others and the planet. And I would add to climate change that oppression and supremacy are the result of modern day humanity separating itself from its roots. So again, this is why ecological healing and collective liberation from supremacy of all kinds are inextricably linked, and why we can return to our ancestral roots as part of the path to healing ourselves, our communities, and Mother Earth. I'll talk later tonight about how relearning our earth-connected roots is a contemplative practice and can look many different ways. But first, I'd like to share a bit of often untold history, the history of how race and systemic inequity in this country were first constructed, because this history is bound up with earth disconnection and with the pillaging of Mother Earth. So this image is an image of the commons in England in the 1500s. And the commoners were English farmers indigenous to that land that practiced earth-revering collectivist culture, meaning the land was shared, the harvest was shared. If there was a widow in the community, food was provided for her from the community. They practiced many rituals designed to celebrate the seasons and pray to the elements and the natural world. With the rise of industrialization, however, wool fabric became a really highly sought after commodity. And the British elite realized that large-scale sheep farms would be far more profitable than taxing farmers. So they decided to evict these English commoners and to fence off the previously commonly held land for commercial use to gain more wealth. And so in order to weaken the commoners' resistance and prepare them for forced immigration to cities so that their labor could be exploited in factories, they had to attack their communal earth-based cultural identity. So the church and the crown vilified wise women, practitioners of pagan traditions or herbal medicine. That's the basis of many witch hunts. Also, rest and ritual themselves were pathologized. So pagan earth-revering practices were condemned to motivate men to work inhumane hours in the wool factories. And so we can see that for this early form of oppression, the elite had to disconnect people from the land itself, our worship of it and its medicine, so that more and more workers would participate in her domination. So then these uprooted English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh people who couldn't find work in factories, who were living in poverty after having lost their land, either immigrated to what is now the US, or were sent there to work off their debts and to participate in land theft from other people. Their land was stolen, they were oppressed, and that scarcity and disconnection set them on a path of doing the same to other earth-revering people. So many of these immigrants arrived in the colonies, and those who were indentured servants actually experienced many of the same oppressive conditions as enslaved Africans in the very beginning. Indentured Europeans and enslaved Africans worked together, lived together, ate together, created families together. At this point in history, race did not exist. people identified by nationality or region. You can imagine over decades, when people are oppressed, they eventually start to unite to resist and seek justice. And the most famous and most significant example of this was Bacon's Rebellion, in which poor Europeans in Virginia, poor indentured European servants, and enslaved Africans rebelled. And the rebellion lasted over a year. And 30% of the population in Virginia was in support of it against the British elite. And there's actually a primary source document in which the British leaders in Virginia wrote a letter to the Crown saying how concerned they were that this was, this really dire situation, and that their strategy for quelling the rebellion was a divide and conquer strategy. And that strategy was to invent race, the construction of race. So it's not until after Bacon's Rebellion in the late 1600s that we first see the use of race words in laws or documents. So for the first time, we see laws enacted to forbid the marriage between white people and other races. For the first time, they start enacting laws to incentivize indentured European servants to submit, not unite with enslaved Africans, to feel psychologically superior, because in law, only white people now could own property. Only white people could earn their freedom, own firearms, et cetera, et cetera. And if white people allied with enslaved Africans, they were denied these privileges and even punished with violence. So race was actually invented to divide and used as a weapon to justify superiority and inferiority based on skin color and religion, with the demonization of pagan and indigenous practices that were about earth reverence and ancestor reverence. So we can see how racism is intimately linked with upholding the power of a few, wealth and land hoarding by a few, which also requires the continued exploitation of the land. So our ancestral wounds and the earth's wounds are bound up together and can be healed together. So whether through violent enslavement or violent Native American boarding schools, enslaved Africans and First Nations people were disconnected from their ancestral practices, language, dress, matriarchal forms of government, as they were removed from their ancestral lands violently. And the stories of murder, mass graves, and brutal punishments of Native American youth in boarding schools are finally reaching more people's awareness, which will hopefully translate into concrete reparations. And for this form of intergenerational trauma, reclaiming and reconnecting with these forms of ancestral wisdom can be healing. Similarly, for descendants of the commoners whose lands were stolen in the British Isles, reclamation of ancient cultural wisdom can be healing. So after this phase of early industrialization and colonization, later waves of European immigrants were also encountering discrimination, even lynching and violent massacres when they arrived. And the best way to avoid this was to earn their white card by assimilating. This image actually shows it's a physical melting pot that the Ford Motor Company used as part of its graduation. So when newer European immigrants arrived, they would walk through the melting pot in the dress with the flag of their country of origin, and they would walk out in a suit American. So many white people in this country, particularly if our family has been here for more than 3 generations, are often without strong ties to our roots before becoming American, because to find success and earn citizenship, assimilation was the cost. And those designing systems of oppression usually first try to strip people of their language and spiritual practices. This was true through violence against the ancestors of people of color on this land and through assimilation for our European ancestors. Oppression requires disconnecting people from their deepest roots because people that are grounded and nourished are harder to keep down. And that's why there's this saying in Spanish, del árbol caído, todos hacen leña. Of a fallen tree, everyone makes firewood. Of a fallen tree, everyone makes firewood. So that melting pot was a version of cutting down the tree. Native American boarding schools were a version of cutting down the tree. Prohibiting the speaking of Spanish in schools was a version of cutting down the tree. And today's division between poor white people and people of color is a version of that firewood. As long as people subscribe to the behaviors, attitudes, language, values of the dominant culture, we earn material rewards sometimes, or we avoid sanctions for being troublemakers in our jobs or families. When we subscribe to dominant culture, we belong, we're successful, but the impact on humanity and the earth is exploitation and destruction. A small percentage of the population, mostly white people, holds most of the land and wealth, and we exploit the earth more and more to make stuff to distract ourselves from this inequity and loneliness, really, that comes with losing our relationship with roots. Jen Frey writes in the book Communicating with Plants, we can learn from the same source who helped our ancestors and the wise ones alive today, the earth herself, including plants, rocks, waters, animals. They are able to help us to heal, to learn, to grow, and to remember who we are, why we are here, and how we can live in harmony with all beings. With their help, we remember the future. One word of caution, our amnesia makes us hungry. In other words, our disconnection from earth-revering practices makes us hungry. We know that something is missing. We try to fill this void through consumption of anything and everything. This is quite obvious when we look at our relationship with the earth, or I would add with our fellow humans, the way we see immigrants as disposable. We cannot consume our way to spirit nor to our remembering. She writes beautifully about how plants can reconnect us with spirit because in addition to our cultural ancestral roots, our common ancestors, all of our common ancestors are the plants, the rocks, the waters, the animals, and the earth herself. So whether your ancestral culture was stolen from your lineage through enslavement or violence, or your ancestors chose to forsake and forget ancestral wisdom to assimilate, the majority of us have lost our root culture. Even people whose families invented exploitation and the culture of domination suffer. They need their own form of healing from that dehumanization of others, and thus themselves, or I should say ourselves. We all have trauma that can lead us to perpetuate domination and aggression and consumption over connection with the earth. And we all have the ancestral wisdom deep within our DNA with which to heal that disconnection. So I'd like to go a bit more in depth now about how I see our disconnection from the land and roots play out for people of different racial identities in equity work. When I collaborate with people of color on racial justice work, I've listened to people share about the emotional labor such justice work requires. It's of course extremely painful to confront systemic oppression. It's particularly painful when you yourself are impacted by that form of oppression structurally. There's internalized oppression, the phenomena that we can believe the biased messages that society sends us about our own group, which is painful to discover. So there's a great emotional toll that's exacted on people of color because of systemic racism. And so working against that oppression requires additional energy and support, and the earth and her elements and ancestral reconnection can be that. I've witnessed a growing movement among communities of color and leaders of color healing through reclaiming ancestral wisdom, spiritual practices, languages, sciences, and ways of knowing. And now turning to my own racial group, disconnection from our roots as white people really influences our ability as well to participate in collective liberation work. Whenever I teach about equity and inclusion, I notice a recurring obstacle to white people's participation in solidarity efforts. And that obstacle is almost always guilt. White people can very often get stuck in guilt when learning the histories of oppression and violence that our ancestors participated in or led. And guilt can lead to paralysis, defensiveness, or saviorism, which all cause a particular form of harm, even if it's well-intentioned. So I always teach about the importance of feeling the grief at our complicity in oppression and then moving through guilt and grief to solidarity. However, that's easier said than done. We can't just cognitively say, oh, I shouldn't stay stuck in guilt. Moving through it requires working with emotion. It requires grieving. And that can be supported by rooting into identity that is not merely whiteness alone. If white people identify only with their whiteness as their culture, or think I don't have a culture, I'm white, that's rather bleak and shaky ground. If white people confuse that culture as their roots, when the concept of whiteness was invented in order to divide and conquer, then we're under-resourced for collective liberation work. We're floundering without a healthy cultural connection. And the culture of domination that many white Americans were socialized to subscribe to was created at a time when European men in power already saw themselves as masters of nature. The earth is something to be divided up and exploited. So that dominant culture is not the root culture for most of us, even us white folks. All of us have ancestry that revered the earth before this manipulation and exploitation. So it's helpful to be supported by those healthy roots in order to move through guilt and shame and grief. And then we can do the true work of looking at the trauma that our ancestors have both created and the trauma that they've experienced. Clarissa Pinkola Estes wrote in Women Who Run with Wolves, "Tears are a river that take you somewhere. Weeping creates a river around the boat that carries your soul life. Tears lift your boat off the rocks, off dry ground, carrying it down river someplace new, someplace better. There are oceans of tears women have never cried, for they have been trained to carry mothers' and fathers' secrets, men's secrets, society's secrets, and their own secrets to the grave. A woman's crying has been considered quite dangerous, for it loosens the locks and bolts on secrets she bears. When we truly feel the grief of our disconnection from the land, for police murders of Black mothers and fathers and children, of disappearances of Indigenous women, it's harder to go back to sleep consuming on Amazon, or buying the latest version of smartphone made of conflict minerals, or distracting ourselves from the war crimes that Israel's inflicting on the people of Gaza daily. And our roots will allow us to stay with those difficult feelings of grief and rage and heartbreak, allow the tears to flow through, and be like the ocean that refuses no river. And from here, we can be of benefit. So let's just take a pause, as this has been a lot. And just again, notice where your feet are touching the ground. Sense back into your roots, connecting you deep, deep into the earth, and recognizing that the earth is holding you. And I'll share a personal story now of guilt getting in the way of solidarity, that shows both the harm that can come from activism without ancestral rootedness and how reconnection can be the antidote. So when I was in middle school in rural Pennsylvania, my best friend was the only Black girl in our entire grade. And when we got to high school a few years later, it was a Quaker school, a boarding school, with the intent to have a much more diverse population, because the Quakers understood just how valuable diversity is. So we got to high school, and for the first time, there were many other Black girls, there were other girls of color, and my best friend finally had people who understood that particular experience of hers, and she became good friends with them, and we started hanging out less. And at the same time, at Quaker school, we were learning all about white privilege, about Jim Crow, about racism, about enslavement. So my confused 14, 15-year-old self was grappling with, okay, it seems like I've lost my best friend, and white people seem to be the bad guys in history, and I don't really want to be a part of that. So my confused racial identity crisis was to try to disown my whiteness and just say, you know what, I'm not white, I'm Mexican. And my mom's family is Mexican. I've since learned that it's only about 10% indigenous Mexican, which makes sense. But at the time, I was just going for it all the way. I am Mexican. I made my AOL screen name Maria Gonzalez, which is my middle name and my mother's maiden name. I started imitating how the Puerto Rican American girls slicked their hair and wore their earrings and their dress. And fortunately, my identity crisis came to a quick close because I found a drawing that I had done when I was really little. We used to go visit my great aunt who had immigrated from Mexico. And I found this drawing, and it was a woman burying jewels in the ground. Unfortunately, there was a little blurb where I had written, my great-great-grandparents lived in Mexico and they were rich and the poor people said it wasn't fair. So they buried their jewels and moved to America. So my teenage self had to grapple with, oh, even my Mexican ancestors were the oppressors. Oh, I think I descend from conquistadors. So I'm much more Spanish than I am Mexican, which makes sense. So this really taught me to acknowledge my whiteness and to try to engage in justice from a reparational stance rather than a guilty and appropriating stance. Much of my teenage racial identity crisis clearly came from guilt and an attempt to bypass my whiteness and my ancestors' enactment of oppression. And recently, I realized the wisdom side of that neurotic strategy. I realized that my 15-year-old self also had wisdom. I was trying to find my place in modern systems of oppression by connecting with a part of my cultural roots that were more recently connected with earth wisdom on an unconscious level, which is how the ancestors often communicate with us. And more recently, as I learn about ancestral healing from ancestral medicine practitioners, I've learned that it's actually recommended to connect with vibrant well ancestors first, ancient ancestors that practiced earth reverence prior to colonization. And for those of us with primarily European ancestry, my European ancestors were practicing earth honoring rituals something like 1,000 years ago, if not longer. On the other hand, my indigenous Mexican ancestors were connected to the land until more recently as 500 years ago, before they married into Spanish families. So there was likely also unconscious wisdom in my young self who was drawn to my mom's Mexican roots. And I can actually even remember my first instant connection with Dia de Muertos. I was around 7 or 8 and it just resonated with me. And I began to make altars out of shoeboxes to celebrate the lives of my pets who had died. I hadn't really lost any humans. My young self really found support in ancestor reverence and in remembering my pets who I now know were my first animal guides. And at that age, I still held the knowing that my animal companions were my relatives as much as my human family. So the superficial appropriation of Latina style and disowning of my whiteness was confused, but my desire to connect with my more recent earth and animal revering ancestors was healthy. And many people are drawn to Native American culture, and it often shows up in problematic ways like fetishizing, meaning seeing Native Americans as only noble or only wise in a sort of objectifying, flattening way. And it shows up in appropriations, taking Native practices, selling them, wearing sacred objects and dress without permission, etc. And so fetishizing and appropriation are harmful and we need to repair if we commit those acts. And there's something authentic, though, in being drawn to Native culture and sacred practice. First Nations peoples, indigenous peoples today have managed in many communities to maintain their languages, connection with nature, and their sacred practices at great cost through intense resistance to extreme violence. And many of us are drawn to that culture and way of being because all of our roots eventually take us back to Mother Earth as our sacred home, the animals as our siblings, elements as our cousins. But white people can reconnect with our own ancestral knowledge. we don't have to take another groups, and we best not, especially when our ancestors have taken so much from these nations already. So for me, that has looked like connecting with my Mexican ancestry, Mexica ancestry, and my Celtic Irish ancestry. And from learning more about Mexica wisdom, I've learned about balancing abundance without hoarding. The Aztecs, which is the more common term for Mexica, conquered other nations and used violence. And in contrast with the Spanish, my Spanish ancestors, they recognized when they had created peace through power and what amount of tribute from those they had subdued, what amount was enough. So recognizing enoughness and right use of power and maintaining respect for the earth are lessons I'm trying to live from my Mexica heritage. Reclaiming my family's Spanish language from my ancestors from Spain has provided a lot of opportunities for me, particularly in learning more about Mayan wisdom and praying to cacao. So Mayans not in my specific Mexican ancestry, but they're a neighbor community that has opened up learning opportunities for non-Mayans. And I've also been learning about Celtic ancestral practices, such as element prayers, which you heard at the beginning. I've learned more about the Druid celebration Samhain and how it inspired our practice of Halloween, how masks were originally worn as a form of protection from unwell spirits when the veil is thinner between the earth and spirit world. So this is teaching me about practices for energetic boundaries, which support me in everyday life, in ritual, and in solidarity work. And I want to be clear that reconnecting with my Mexica ancestry and Celtic ancestry doesn't mean that I'm no longer white and American. I am a white American. I don't claim indigeneity now or claim to be a druidess just because I'm studying those forms of spirituality. I am Buddhist because I took refuge in the Dharma with a Tibetan Rinpoche. I could maybe become a druidess if I studied with practicing druids and dedicated my life to that lineage, just as people of any culture and ethnicity do become Christian nuns or Buddhist monks. But I think what I'm trying to say is that out of respect for the lineages that we come from, we don't want it to become a performance by overclaiming to be what we're not. On the other hand, we don't want to look at it as hopeless or impossible to reconnect with the more specific traditions of sacred spirituality that run through our veins just because our ancestors stopped practicing them. We've been trained by colonialism and patriarchy not to trust our intuition, and our intuition is what opens up the path to reconnect with ancestry, whether that's communicating directly with well ancestors or receiving messages from plants and nature. And that's all of our original ancestral practices. We need ancestral wisdom, particularly for climate justice work, because right relationship with the land and animals existed among Indigenous peoples in the Americas and Europe and Asia and Africa on every continent pre-colonization. So to connect personal and familial healing with collective healing, these are some questions I reflect on and ask participants in my solidarity workshops to contemplate. So what are we carrying in our lineage due to our ancestors' experience of erasure, enslavement, discrimination, or famine, war, witch burnings, genocide? What are we carrying due to our ancestors' participation in assimilation, participation in enslaving, land theft, genocide, desecration of the earth? And how does that trauma show up in us now and our ability to work for collective liberation? Does it show up as depression, numbness, rage, paternalism, disconnection from the earth or emotions or other beings? And then how can ancestral healing and earth reconnection support collective liberation? What does it look like? Reparations for some of us, reclamation for some of us, reconciliation. So the exploration of healthier ancestral practices, like I was describing before, allows us to have greater capacity to explore these questions about ancestors who actively participated in creating systems of oppression. For example, I recently learned that some of my English ancestors were likely indentured servants, like those I mentioned in the mini history lesson, who then lived in poverty in the southern US during early years of violent settler colonialism. And my great great grandfather was a second lieutenant in the Confederate Army. So how does desperation for resources, loss of land, the shame of being poor, the need to believe in superiority live in my DNA? And what reparations do I need to make today for the harm committed by him and other ancestors? How can I also bring healing to the desperation and shame in my lineage to support those reparations? My grandfather on my mother's side, Ricardo Gonzalez, is the direct descendant of a mayor of Mexico, his grandfather. And my grandfather had a lot of really healthy pride and love for being Mexican, which came with wisdom, such as connection to vibrant stories and energy, joyful music, a gift of leadership that likely ran in the line. And he used that intellect and leadership to analyze the world with values of equity and inclusion. At the same time, I've also been grappling recently with how my mom's family has both tried to assimilate into whiteness to avoid discrimination as Mexicans in Texas. And as a family, we talk only of being Mexican and never Spanish, although the majority of our lineage is Spanish. So it hit me how that form of claiming to be native Mexican, when those who held power in the recent lineage were Spanish, is a way of denying the land theft that they participated in. And I know none of my living family are doing that consciously, but I think my great great grandfather, those ancestors may have engaged in the narrative of being Mexican with conquistador intentions. Because if they were Mexican, then that land was rightfully theirs. They created Mexico, just like early Europeans in the US claimed to be native to distinguish themselves from later German and Italian immigrants, and thereby erasing indigenous North Americans. So how does that erasure and entitlement live in me? What reparations can I participate in? What dominant and oppressive ways of being are most deep in me? And how can exploring them with compassion and grieving allow me to show up to be most well as possible and of benefit today? And just to name that this is a very brief reflection on 4 of my lineages, and it's not to make a hierarchy of ancestors with Spanish and English all less well than my Mexican and Irish. Ancestry is so much more complex than that. And each of our familial stories is different within historical patterns. But from what I know about my ancestry in each of the 4 lineages, I can feel the type of wounds and disconnection in each of my lineages. Some of them are more wounded by doing the dominating of earth and people, and some are more wounded by loss of land and power. And then there's other flavors of intergenerational trauma as well. So I'm getting low on time. So I'll just say, the more I get to know my roots, the wisdom my ancestors carried, their suffering and the harm they enacted because of it, the more grounded and supported by the earth and her elements I feel. And I can understand I'm part of a web of human experience and ancestral inheritance. So my issues are not just personal. Systemic issues can't be solved by individuals. And so from this place, I can engage with systemic issues and engage in justice from a nourished and connected and humble place. So let's look a bit more at what ancestral reconnection as contemplative practice can look like. Contemplative practices are so important because they help us get quiet, back into our bodies, into a state of openness and listening. And from here, we can notice the communication from plants, subtle energies, the elements, animals, our ancestors. So we practiced grounding practice, rooting into the earth, sense perceptions to practice embodiment. It doesn't have to be sitting meditation. It could be tuning into sense perceptions on a walk, forest bathing, movement practices, anything that gets us into a conscious state. If you watched Jordan Qualia's Café Contemplative, he went really deep into just how diverse and how many different contemplative practices there are. And when we get into these conscious states, we can reclaim our intuition, which is in itself healing wounds of colonialism. And this supports deeper reconnection with the natural world. Contemplative sound practices can be a great way to tune into emotions and intuition and embodiment. And any songs or nature sounds that bring us into our hearts and bodies work wonderfully. And certainly exploring sacred sounds from your lineages can be potent. There's also courses that support ancestral reconnection. It can really be like a homecoming to connect with sacred plants from the lands where your ancestors come from, but really any plant can communicate healing messages to us. So regardless of the practice that resonates most with you, once we're more tuned into our intuition and state of awareness, we start receiving messages from the natural world in the form of knowings, blessings, synchronicity. And this is ancestral reconnection because plants and animals and the elements are all of our ancestors. So I want to offer a practice as we close. And it's inspired by this writing on trees. Many cultures have a particular tree they view as sacred and carrying wisdom. And Jennifer Frey writes, "These trees connect the earth and the cosmos or heavens. They also connect the present with the past, including the ancestors. Trees help to hold the memory of a landscape. When we connect with them, we have access to the events that occurred in a specific area." And this resonated for me particularly when I recently sat on a sacred mountain in Ireland, and this ring of trees surrounding felt particularly like grandfathers. She continues on, "Trees contain the memory of life before colonization. They hold the imprint of a time when humans lived in harmony with nature." So I invite you to keep connecting with actual trees near where you live. But in the meantime, I'll guide a closing practice that you can do sitting right where you are. And so at this moment, if you have a candle or incense, I invite you to light that candle, thanking the fire for its life-giving warmth. Thanking the fire for its capacity to transform. Using smell of the candle or the smoke to help you come a little bit more deeply back into your body. Feeling your feet on the ground. With each deep breath, sensing more and more into the sense of being held by the earth beneath you. Now you can take a sip of water if you have it and let it cleanse and refresh your mind and emotions, noticing its taste, the temperature on your tongue and in your throat and belly. You can thank the water for the life it provides and its cleansing, healing power. Over the next few breaths, send some gratitude to the air for supporting you every moment of your life, bringing freshness and reminding us of impermanence with each breath. Again, allowing your roots to help you drop deep down into that sense of being held by the earth. Thank her for the grounding and nourishing presence and love that she provides. I invite you, if it feels right, to repeat quietly to yourself the Celtic prayer that I've adapted to the form of a compassion practice. So often it's easiest for us to feel love and compassion for our loved ones. So we'll start there. If you like, you can repeat quietly to yourself. Deep peace of the running wave to my loved ones. Deep peace of the quiet earth to my loved ones. Deep peace of the flowing air to my loved ones. Deep peace of the shining stars to my loved ones. Deep peace of the running wave to me. Deep peace of the flowing air to me. Deep peace of the quiet earth to me. Deep peace of the shining stars to me. And finally, deep peace of the running wave to all beings everywhere. Deep peace of the flowing air to all beings everywhere. Deep peace of the quiet earth to all beings everywhere. Deep peace of the shining stars to all beings everywhere. So the elements, plants, and Mother Nature are our greatest allies in this work of ancestral reconnection, contemplative practice, and earth healing. Plants are naturally showing us another way to be in relationship that's antithetical to power hierarchies, modeling cycles of rest and growth and symbiosis. The last thing I'll say is I recently learned that when a tree is cut down in the forest, other trees reach out with their root tips, sending sugar water and nutrients via the mycelium. And this basically IV drip from other trees can keep a stump alive for decades or even centuries. And trees do this not just for their own species. So I invite us to reflect on what we can learn from our shared ancestors, the trees, the animals, the plants, and the elements, about how to live together on this beautiful planet. And as I engage with questions arising, I know I went over, so there's not a ton of time, but there is some time for questions. I'm going to drop in the chat a flyer that's just got some information on an ancestral reconnection retreat that I'll be guiding with the fabulous Carla Burns, who introduced me tonight, and also my amazing sister, Caroline Leach. And it'll be this March 2025 in Guatemala, where my sister lives on Lake Atitlan, which is a really powerful place. And part of the funds from the retreat go towards reparations for Indigenous peoples impacted by harm committed by my lineage. So you can find more information in the flyer, and I'll also share the website, and I'll take any questions.
Hey, Bets, thank you so much. I'm definitely feeling impacted by everything, and also just the profound simplicity and availability of our elements and of our earth to healing and toward collective liberation. At first it felt like, my goodness, how will I connect? And then you just gave us such a simple, beautiful, natural way of engaging in how we connect. And it's definitely has me feeling more compassionate and more radiant and like more like we can do this. We can. So thank you so much. We have a few questions that I'd love to read aloud, please, for you to help us. First of all, we had some folks who were very interested in the book source of the poem that you read, that beautiful poem. So maybe you can drop that in the chat.
Can indeed.
And I know you had mentioned this, Betsy, a little bit in these last slides around utilizing plant medicine as a way to reconnect with Earth and some of our ancestral roots. But I have a question here that might ask that you engage that a little deeper. This attendee says that they see some people going to ceremony after ceremony, which can be akin to bypassing, and have also experienced ceremony where they actually feel the collective pain of the earth when tuning into the plant ancestors. And how, in your opinion, Betsy, does plant medicine play a role in a sustainable way of feeling the earth's pain as a starting point to healing?
Yeah, wow. Well, fabulous questions. I think, to start with the question about going to ceremony after ceremony and how it can become a form of bypassing, whenever it becomes like consumption, like consumption without end, that's a good signal to ourselves of like, oh, I don't think I'm authentically connecting with the wisdom of the plants, because plant wisdom is not about overconsumption or chasing, bliss or, any of those states. And so actually I would recommend the book by Jen Frey called Communicating with Plants. I referenced it a couple of times because she talks about specifically that any type of overconsumption and chasing, including ceremony and spiritual practice, is actually keeping us disconnected because we're not dropping in to listen to the true gifts and medicine of the plants. So her book has a lot more about that. Will you repeat the second part of the question? I was multitasking and finding that poem title.
Yeah, really, can plant medicine play a role in a sustainable way of feeling into the earth's pain as a starting point to healing?
Well, first I'll say too, because there's so much, and I want to name that I am, I consider myself a practitioner of plant reverence, element reverence, not an expert. It's part of the path that I'm going down right now, and it's newer in the last couple of years. And I think sometimes when people hear plant medicine, we immediately go to psychedelics. And so it's just to name that all plants have a particular gift, and some folks go down, the psychedelic route, and that can be powerful when practiced with folks who have trained, in a lineage, or have mentorship in a lineage where it's held really well and it's, a safe and trauma-informed container. But like cacao, mugwort, yarrow, dandelions, plant medicine is really, and again, this book, Communicating with Plants, I recommend. Each plant has its own message, and it might be different for each of us, and they can be really subtle, like sipping blue lotus tea as you practice coming into the sense perceptions. And so when I hear the question, and I'm not quite sure if this is what the person's wondering about, but whether it's sustainable, I wonder if they're maybe thinking about, more sort of powerfully psychedelic plants, that feels like sort of, maybe just always doing that is not sustainable. But I think when we're really getting quiet and tuning in with a range of different plants, for me, I can only speak for me, it feels very nourishing and supportive, and grief does come up, when we're connecting with ancestral trauma and earth destruction. And so that's why I think the key is starting with well and healthy and vibrant ancestry, starting with really getting into and grounding, in a way that's connecting with joy and roots that allows us to handle the grief or, you know, the other more difficult emotions as they come. What would you say to that, Carla? I'm curious.
Let me think of this. I think that you answered it so beautifully. I think that it's how I think the more that we're actually grounded in the present moment and what's in front of us, I think that that actually informs. And again, I just love the simplicity of saying, yes, we can absolutely engage in psychedelics as plant medicine, but there's plants everywhere that are our medicine. And so what is actually the right relationship that we want to have with the plants and for this moment? And can we start to investigate those ways of really starting to engage in a healing sort of way? Because I think it can be, what do I want to say? I feel like it could feel like so much to bite off when we're also mixing psychedelic experiences with always with plant medicine and healing, and that it can feel a little bit more accessible sometimes when we start to say, okay, I don't always have to have non-ordinary experiences in order to really be connecting with my ancestry. And I also think that's what contemplative practice gives us, is actually the magic of the mundane, or what we determine as ordinary magic in a particular sort of way. And then it doesn't have to feel so overwhelming. And I think that can be a really great touch point. And then maybe that can be an avenue in which to explore psychedelics, of course. So, yeah.
Yes. Love that. Ordinary magic.
Yeah. So we are actually out of time. But Betsy, just wanted to thank you so much for all the care that you put into this. I also, for myself, have a question around your lineage reflection questions. They were so beautiful, and I'm wondering if there's a way that you might possibly share those with participants. Also, they felt like such a wonderful way to access some of this work. And of course, it sounds like you're doing further work in advertising. I know that you are, in ways that we could go deeper with this and explore more. This is obviously just one layer. And so I felt it. So just thank you for your time and everything that you gave.
You're welcome. I'm seeing my best friend is here from Baltimore.
Really?
Yes, wasn't sure if she was going to be here.
Oh, well, hello, bestie.
So I'm putting the questions in the chat, but there's a lot, but they're also on the website link that I put there. Those questions are listed also on the page about the retreat, so that those ones won't disappear when the webinar ends, for folks who want to capture them.
Okay. Well, Betsy, thank you so much on behalf of Naropa University, on behalf of Contemplative Cafe. Thank you so much for your time and for teaching us and for helping us to grapple with something that felt so big and so complex, but is actually very available, very accessible, and possible. So thank you for your heart and for your compassion and for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, my friend.
All right.
Thank you all for being here.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Keep in touch.